As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. Welcome to the 6th episode in my season of Summer Shorts, a series of shorter episodes where you'll hear from writers working in the trenches right alongside you. Each week, they'll share their fears, doubts, and questions they have about the craft of writing and their writing lives. Consider it your backstage pass to my coaching practice. This week, you'll hear from Amanda Creasey, an English teacher and outdoors writer with an undergraduate degree from Michigan State University and a graduate degree from the University of Denver. Her debut novel, An Expected End, was published in October 2023. During this episode, Amanda and I explore the existential question every writer wrestles with at some point in their writing lives. Who cares if I write? And does my work matter? And what happens if I stop? But before we get to our conversation, I have a few questions for you. Do you wonder if the time you put into your writing is worth it? Have you ever given a project your all only to be disappointed by the results? Are you trying to keep up appearances to please the people in your life who see publishing a book as a ticket to fame and fortune? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen along. Now let's get to my conversation with Amanda Creasey. Hey writers, have you written a draft or two of a memoir only to feel completely lost? Do you wonder what the story really is or how to structure it? Or have you received competing advice from some people who love certain parts of your story while others don't? Or worst of all, have you been ghosted by agents and editors or received the cryptic, great writing, but just not for us email? Most writers think the answer is diving deeply into their pages. But to figure out what's missing, what needs to be retooled, and what needs to be tossed, you need a bird's eye view of your manuscript. That's what I'll provide in Camp Structure, my proven program that will help you understand how stories work, decide what parts of your life actually belong in your book, and develop a clear path through the revision landmines most memoirists face. As a member of Camp Structure, you'll benefit from expert coaching, membership in a motivated cohort, monthly Ask Me Anything office hours, and instruction that will help you finish this book and the next one. So if you want to feel confident about the story you're telling, clarity around how to write it, and the focus needed to get the job done, sign up for Camp Structure by clicking on the link in the show notes. Camp begins on Tuesday, September 10th, which will be here before you know it, so be sure to grab your spot. Well, hello, Amanda. I am so glad that you are on the Writing Your Resilience podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So, you and I met a few years back. You were running a podcast yourself, and you also live in Richmond, which is about an hour away from me. So, I've gotten a chance to actually meet you in person and to give you a hug, which you're a great hugger, by the way.
Thank you.
So, what would you like everyone to know about you as a writer and any of your projects?
I have two primary writing roles right now. One of them is I am the outdoors writer for Cooperative Living magazine. So every other month, I get to go on some great outdoor adventure. Usually it's in the state of Virginia. Occasionally it's in Tennessee or Kentucky or even Maryland. And then I write about the experience. My most recent one was I got on a pontoon boat and I went for up close views of the ponies on Assateague and Chincoteague. So that was really fun. But I've done everything from, hikes to caves and visiting the President's Heads in Williamsburg and written about it for that magazine. So that's a great writing role that I treasure. And then my other big role is I am a debut novelist. My very first novel launched in October, just this past October, and it's called An Expected End. And it's a work of literary speculative fiction. It was traditionally published by a relatively new woman-owned small press out of Virginia Beach. So kind of like to try to keep things local or at least in state. So I was very pleased with that aspect. And even though it takes place in a world where people can find out when they're going to die, it's not really a book about death. It's more a book about life and what we decide to do with our life, how we decide to live it, and how we decide to spend our time. It's kind of a book about being human. And I feel like that's maybe a good segue into the question that you and I came here to discuss today.
Yes, being human. And oh my gosh, is trying to be human while you're writing so hard. So that does sound like a great segue. So let's dive into your question.
So the question that I've been pondering that I think probably lots of writers and probably lots of people think about a lot is an existential question, really. And it is, why does my work matter? And people
Mm,
might also conceive of that question as like, who cares if or what I write or if or what I'm doing? Is anyone ever going to read this? Do I even care
yes.
what I'm doing anymore? Why am I doing this? Does my work matter? And
Mm-hmm.
if it does, why? What's important about it?
Yeah, and before I hit the record button, you and I were having this conversation about some of the drivers for this question for you personally.
Mhm.
So, what's bringing this to the front of mind right now?
I think that my novel actually kind of explores this question. And I've been working on, or did work on, the novel for, gosh, the better part of 5 years, right? So this question
Mm-hmm.
has been at the forefront of my professional mind, my creative mind, my personal mind for a really long time. The project, the novel, played a really pivotal role in my asking that question. So, like, Naked True style, I worked on the book for a long time. I would
Yeah.
stay up way past my bedtime to work on it. I would get up really early, and I mean like 3:45 in the morning early, not
Mm-hmm.
like 5 a.m. early, like middle of the night early.
That is some dedication, by the
Yeah,
way.
yes, to work on this. And like drafting the book and writing the book, that was a very joyous, fulfilling, satisfying, wonderful journey. I would do that again in a
Mm-hmm.
heartbeat. But the revising process was less enjoyable, much more arduous than the actual writing process. So much work, so much effort, so much hope, so much time. And it really, just being honest, it hasn't sold that many copies, which I expected. But the numbers have been disappointing, even from my relatively realistic, I think, expectations. There hasn't been much of a financial return. I've held
Mm-hmm.
readings, I've held signings, I've been to book club events. Many of them were very well attended and very engaging and inspiring and enjoyable and fulfilling. But then I've also had readings and events where nobody came, or two people came,
Mm-hmm.
and they were people that I knew that came out of, support, moral support for
Mm-hmm.
me. So when I've had these discouraging moments, that's when I end up asking, like, why am I even doing this? And despite that, I'm doing it again. I'm revising a second novel. So obviously there's some reason I'm doing this, or it would have stopped after the debut novel. So I don't think I'm a glutton for punishment, but I am asking, not at all with the intent of stopping doing it, but what drives me? Why?
Yeah.
Why am I doing this?
And I think understanding that for yourself is so important because writing and publishing are two very different things.
Definitely.
Writing and revising, which, yes, can be very grueling. That is so true. That is about creativity. That is about bringing forth into the world whatever, your soul calls you to do, and you can interpret soul in whatever way you want, but something, encourages you to do this work. Publishing is a business. And, the hard truth about the business of publishing is most books don't sell that
Right.
many copies. In fact, Jane Friedman, she writes about this stuff all the time on her paid newsletter, The Hot Sheet. And she did a study, and this was a couple years ago. And the average book sells less than 1,000 copies.
Yes, I recently read an article. I think that was part of her study, actually, or a result of her study, maybe.
Yeah. And I was reading something this past week, and I can't remember where I read it. They were saying about 400 to 700 that you could realistically expect. So it is humbling and hard if you are an author and you put all of this work into it. And then, of course, there are all of these people out in the world who love you and who think, oh, yeah, as soon as this book is published, oh my gosh, you're going to be buying a mansion and you're going to
Right.
be,
You're going to be able to quit your full-time day job and
right.
be like the writer, capital
Exactly.
T, capital W.
Yes. And so, when you have all of that happening and then you face the realities of it, of course, anyone is going to question, why do I do this? And yet you are doing it again. Some of the things that I tell people to think about are, what is success for you? That's something that Athena Dixon, she talks about that a lot because that success and I agree with this part, should probably not be tied to book sales. It
Right.
needs to be tied to something else. Getting that note from the reader who
Mhm.
says, "This book really touched me," or "I love this idea," or, getting the ability to do other things. Like maybe your book has an interesting premise. So now you get to go talk about that premise to different
Mhm.
people, or you get to, I don't know, go to schools and talk about it at your school or at various schools. So I think thinking about that for yourself and understanding what that is helpful. But then, thinking about the bigger picture, what is it about writing that matters to me, and specifically writing this book? Because, you're a fiction writer, and I
Mhm.
have your book. It's actually on my end table right now because my husband's
Hey,
reading it.
how
It's got a
fabulous.
fantastic premise. I love that
Thank
premise.
you.
There's so much great stuff with it. And, the very best books, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, they are exploring a question inside of us,
Mhm. Mhm.
something that we don't understand. And, in fiction, you might be, testing the boundaries of it. Maybe you're afraid of anger. So you're going to write this really violent book so that you can explore the opposite end of anger or find ways to work through anger. I mean, there's lots of ways that this can work. But thinking about what is that essential question
Mhm.
inside myself that really matters, that is the reason why I'm doing this writing. And so, if you think about this new project that you're working on, or you can think about your other project, what do you think that question is for you?
Oh, that is a good question. You posed some other good questions in a recent edition of your newsletter that I actually think I emailed you and said, like, these are such good questions to get me thinking about our upcoming interview. And I think that there are lots of questions that drive me, and I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of them are existential questions. And I think maybe the biggest question that drives me off the top of my head, in addition to the one we're discussing right now, is what matters?
Yeah.
So less specifically, does what I'm doing matter? Is a
Mm-hmm.
bigger question of like, what matters? Because if you can
Yes.
answer that question, then you can answer all the other questions regarding your purpose, your meaning, your existence, your goals, your day-to-day choices, and which ones
Mm-hmm.
get you closer to what matters. But first, you have to figure out what that is. I think my debut novel explores that. And I think the second one I'm working on also is an attempt to answer that question, the discovery of what matters.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that I know your first book delves into that.
Mhm.
So, as you think about, how do you see the world differently as a result of finishing your first book?
Oh, that's a good question. I think right now, I'm not 100% sure I see the world differently. I think a lot of it is still pretty personal and small. I think right now the little girl in me who always wanted to be a writer, I'm like, I did it for
Mm-hmm.
her. Like I've always wanted to do this thing. I've always wanted to hold my own book in my hand, and I did it. And in some ways that's enough. The self-satisfaction, I think you have to be somewhat intrinsically motivated, kind of like
Mm-hmm.
what you were talking about earlier, to do this. It can't all be for money or fame or publishing
Yeah.
acclaim. You have to want to do it for yourself or for people or causes that
Mm-hmm.
really matter to you. I do think that maybe it's helped me shape a little bit of an understanding of the important things in life and what
Mm-hmm.
matters. I'm still exploring that, like I said. It also kind of helped me question why writing matters so much to
Mm.
me, which brings me back to your last newsletter. You asked, I have it in front of me. How do you show up in your life when you've taken the time to write? How
Yeah.
do you show up in your life when you don't take the time to write?
Mm-hmm.
And which version of yourself do you want to share with the world? So if I'm not writing for acclaim and I'm not writing for fame and I'm not writing for money and I'm not writing for publishing, I definitely show up better when I have written, even if
Yeah.
it's just like a journal entry or a paragraph or a sentence or two about what happened today.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe my products or any writer's products, especially if they're only going to sell 400 to 700 copies, maybe the product doesn't matter for the sake of the product or for the work itself. The work itself might not garner anything or reach the audience we intended or make us money, but maybe just the act of doing that work allows a better version of ourselves to show up in the other areas of our lives that might matter or that might have a greater reach. We all want our novel or our article or our poem to reach an audience, right? To make
Yes.
a difference, to make an impact, to make some positive waves. But if that doesn't happen, are you able to make waves somewhere else because you did that, because you got
Mm-hmm.
that off your chest or created that thing and felt good about it, whatever it was?
Absolutely. That is a beautiful answer. And yeah, so when we show up differently, that reverberates out into our world and it shows other people when we really focus on what matters to us, we give other people permission to focus on what matters for them. So in some ways, there we are we are laying the foundations for
Mm-hmm.
other people to do things. And what I can say about your book, the premise again is just so great. And I think about it. So I recently turned 50.
I recently turned 40, so milestone.
Happy birthday. These
Happy birthday to
milestone
you.
birthdays, they
I know.
they do so much. And you know, so when you get to these birthdays, like this, when you're getting up there a little bit, we're still youngins, but I'm past that middle point. You know, I'm closer to the death day than the birthday.
Mm-hmm.
So what am I going to do with that time?
Right.
How can I make that matter? And I think this is an important thing for writers because writing takes a lot of dedication. I mean, I am bowing to you for getting up at 3:45 in the
I
morning.
don't miss it. I don't miss it.
That will never happen for me. I mean, unless, menopause.
Unless you're biologically awakened at 3:45 in the morning.
Exactly, which sometimes happens. I'll go bleak and I'm
Yeah.
awake and then I can't get back to sleep. But I do not willingly get up at 3 a.m. on a regular basis. It just doesn't happen. But, it's important to be willing to do that and make room for joy
Mm-hmm.
and make room for fun because I think something that can happen to a lot of writers is we get so attached to the outcome. I've got to get my book done. I'm going to focus on getting my book done. You let everything else go. And you
Yeah.
do have to let some things go in order to be a writer. That is just the truth. If you want to get things done, and especially if you're not retired,
Mm-hmm.
you cannot do everything in your life. So you have to figure out what's important. But sometimes we forget that other things are important. And so if we have shirked all of the other things and pushed them away, and we have worked our tails off to figure out what this book is about and get it done, and then the publishing experience doesn't end up being what we would hope it to be,
Mm-hmm.
that's a double disappointment.
Yeah, definitely. It's very painful. I think you're right that I I hesitate to use the word balance because I feel like that word's gotten thrown around so much, and I actually feel like that pressurizes a situation.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the better word would be prioritization. I mean,
Yeah,
I think you need to, if you want to be a writer, I mean, first of all, let me just say to everyone listening, like if you write, you're a writer. I think
exactly.
I think a lot of us have this imposter syndrome. It's like, I'm not a writer until I have an article published. I'm not a writer until I have my MFA. No, no, no. If you are writing with any sort of regularity or compulsion or joy, you're a writer. You qualify. You
Yep.
met the requirement. But if you want to be very serious about your writing, then I don't think you don't have to make it the only thing.
Right.
It does need to be at the top of your priority list, but like, people will say you need to write every day. And I know that that's like a popular belief. I don't write every day. I don't write every day and I'm widely published and I have a novel and I love writing. I do not get to write every day. It's not realistic for me working full time and traveling the way I do. And you cannot write without living. You
Yes,
can't. You have to
exactly.
live too. That's where your material comes from. Whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, your material comes from the life you have and lead outside of your writing. Art mirrors life. There's a reason for that saying. The life has to happen. So it's a priority. It's not the end all be all. And you do have to prioritize it, especially when you're in the middle of a project. It's important. But things like family and love
Yes.
and whatever else, nature, your job, the thing that makes you, puts the lights on in your house.
Right.
Those are all things that have to be important too. And like you said, if your project doesn't bring you the benefits and results that you thought, are you going to be satisfied if you sacrificed what you sacrificed for it? You
Right.
have to be doing some of it for the sake of the joy.
Absolutely. Yes, you have to be doing it for the joy and in a balanced way. I think that's so important because if you don't live life, it's going to be really difficult. In the same way that, if you are submitting your workplaces, I tell writers this all the time, don't just submit it to one place
Hmm.
and then put all your eggs in that basket and all your hopes and dreams. Now, if you are submitting to certain kinds of places, like for instance, let's say you submit to the New York Times as an example, you cannot pitch the same story to another place. You can't. You have to wait till they say no and then you can submit it somewhere else. However, if you're submitting to literary journals, submit to 5 places. Don't just stop with one.
Hmm.
And even if you are pitching to these higher level places, pitch 2 or 3 stories to different places so that you feel like there's always another egg in the basket.
Right.
There's another
There's always
reason.
hope.
Exactly. You have another way to hope. And I tell writers all the time, when you get that rejection, which all of us receive rejections, that is a
Uh-huh.
normal part of the writing process. And it doesn't go away, by the way.
Hmm.
As you write more, you do get some more yeses, but you also get more nos. As soon as you get that rejection, get it back out there. I mean, be thoughtful about it. And if your spidey senses are saying, or you're getting a bunch of form rejections, that's a signal you need to do more work. Don't just wildly send your work out, but thoughtfully say, is more revision needed? And then get it back out there so you have something else to work on. And as far as those book events,
Hmm.
I think there's 2 ways to handle that. One, it is hard to think about, like, to put yourself out there and do these book events. And I know someone who's a national book award winning author, done all kinds of big things out in the world. And I was at a meeting with a bunch of different writers, and people were talking about book launch events and, events at bookstores and different places. This is a big name person. I'm not going to name them because it's not necessary, but
Hmm.
just to know, big name person talked about the number of times they had the book event where it was her and the bookstore owner.
Yeah.
It happens a lot. And so I think
Hmm.
sometimes writing about that and writing about that in a public way, not
Hmm.
in a boohoo, poor me kind of way
No,
or a
no.
manipulative
Yeah.
way, but
Just a
writing about
realistic
that.
way.
Yeah, writing about that
Reality.
experience can also bring community in, because the more you're connected to the community of writers who get it and understand what this life is like and what you're going through, the more you can feel less alone. Because I think a lot of these doubts and these existential questions get louder when we are by ourselves.
Yeah.
And they can scream in our head, and that can make us feel like, why are we even doing this?
Hmm. Well, that's true for any endeavor, right? Like community is so important. If you have a support system and you have people who are doing the same things and trying the same things and failing just as frequently as they're succeeding, and you're not alone, it makes everything so much easier. It makes every failure easier. It makes every mistake easier. It makes every unattended book event easier.
Absolutely. So, what are you going to take away from this conversation?
Oh gosh, what am I going to take away from this conversation? I think one of the big things is kind of what we were just talking about, is that community is crucial in your
Hmm.
sense of meaning and your sense of purpose. Even if you're not reaching the audience that you hoped or the size of the audience that you hoped, neither is anybody else, realistically.
Yeah.
Like, no matter how high or how low your expectations are, there's so many quotes and so much literature out there about trying to not even have realistic expectations, but just not have expectations, which in and of itself
Right.
is an unrealistic expectation. Anyway, trying to minimize the number of expectations you have and cultivate your community. Writing can be such a solitary exercise and
Hmm.
activity, but it shouldn't be. I mean, maybe the writing process needs to be. You need that solitude and you need that quiet and you need that introspection. But the writing community is critical. Critical.
Absolutely. Well, I could talk to you for hours,
Oh, thanks. The feeling's mutual.
and yet the podcast must come to an end,
And all good
as it
things must.
always does. I know, I know. That's the hardest part. So I'm going to end with 3 lightning round questions. And the first is, what is the best piece of writing advice you've ever received?
Well, we kind of just talked about this, but it's to get involved in the writing community. There is so much that you don't know, you don't know. So much. No matter how seasoned of a writer you are. There's so much, especially with AI right now. There's so much
Mm-hmm.
you don't know. So you can learn from fellow writers, local booksellers, writing groups, writing workshops, writing conferences. Like my debut novel would not exist if I had tried to do it entirely by myself. My writing groups, my writing workshop, writing classes, fellow authors were instrumental. Even my role as the outdoors writer, I would not have if I were not a member of Virginia Outdoor Writers Association, because that's how I found out about it. So even if you join writing communities for no other reason than learning about opportunities, get involved in a writing community, whatever that is
Absolutely.
for you.
And shout out to James River Writers, which is a
Yes,
writing community that we're both a part of. And
yes,
that's where I saw you, was at the James River Writers
yes.
Conference.
And without James River Writers, I would have never learned about the writing workshop that produced the first draft of what is now my debut novel. So yes, shout out to James River Writers for sure.
I love that. So, as you're working on your new project and also promoting your book that's out in the world, how are you nurturing your resilience?
It's probably is not the wisest answer. I've given this some thought, but to be honest, one way I nurture my resilience is by thinking about all the writers I know of who felt like fail. I teach American literature by day. That's my day job. And so many writers that I teach, F. Scott Fitzgerald, for example, Walt Whitman, either felt like failures or were criticized as failures by literary critics. And now they're revered and part of the canon or otherwise successful. And so I remind myself that if my book has meant something to even a handful of people, even one
Mm-hmm.
person, then it was a worthwhile endeavor. I also make sure to remind myself that I do love to write for the sake of writing, regardless of what the external results of that are. I enjoy the process. So even if no one else cares about what I'm writing, I'm resilient in my writing because I do write for myself, at least sometimes, at least to an extent. And I write because I just have to. Like there's no way for me not to. That's like breathing, right? Like I might not get to do it every day, but I have to do it. And it's a worthwhile exercise because I love it. Also,
Beautiful.
I try to use my writing for good. I try to do like charitable events and
Mm-hmm.
donations and things like that. So I can say like, even if no one reads this, if they bought it and it meant I donated 80% of the proceeds to the animal shelter, it did some good.
I love that. And I would say that the idea of imagining all of the people who are in the same boat with you and who
Mm-hmm.
also felt like failures is a great exercise. And in fact, the Dalai Lama, he encourages us to think about that in all kinds of situations because that is how you build compassion
Mm-hmm.
and connection to everyone else. If anyone wants to connect with you, learn more about you, or buy your beautiful book, how can they do that?
I'm on Instagram a lot, and it's just Amanda Sue Creasey with an EY, Amanda underscore Sue underscore Creasey. I also have a website. It's amandasuecreasey.com. You can sign up for my newsletter on my website. It comes out every other Tuesday, and I'm on Substack at amandasuecreasey.substack.com.
And all of that will be in the show notes. And shout out to your newsletter because in addition to having some really thoughtful things that you add, we get to see your beautiful little dogs.
Yes, and Archie the parrot now too. You got the littles and the parrot. You if not for nothing else, you get cute animal photos.
Many cute animal
Many
photos,
cute
and it is a
animal photos.
delight. So if you just need a pick me up, you're not even interested in writing, just see those pictures and your life will be better.
Thank you.
Well, it has been an absolute delight to have you on today. Thank you so much for being here, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this and I have really enjoyed our conversation.
Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.